This podcast
is shareable. I'm going to go out on a limb and say this either is or will become your favorite podcast. This is Shareable, the show that's so good, you got to tell someone about it. Every episode, we explore the impact of people and technology on our lives and careers, and we send you away with something shareable. Now, without further ado, let's get to it.
Hi, I'm Stacey Copas, and on the 2nd of December 1990, my life changed forever. I was cooling off in a relative's backyard pool with my younger brother, who was 10. I was 12 at the time, and a couple of other boys. And as I did every time I visited this relative's place, I just thought the most fun thing to do was to just keep climbing up on the edge of the pool and diving in over and over again, getting yelled at to stop, but being that age and being invincible, I didn't think anything could go wrong. And I kept doing this over and over again. And then there was one particular time that I remember standing on the edge of the pool thinking, I'm splashing too much as I'm diving into the pool. So I stopped for a moment and I thought, what could I do to make a really perfect, clean dive? So what I thought I could do is to try and keep my legs straight and hold my feet together. And I thought, in theory, that would make a really nice, clean entry into the pool. So I did just that. I took a deep breath and I dived in, and it felt like any other dive until I went to try and swim up to the surface and I realised I couldn't move. I didn't feel any pain. I didn't feel like anything had gone wrong, but I was conscious, panicking, holding my breath, trying to get the attention of my brother. And when I realised I couldn't hold my breath any longer, I gave in, and as my lungs filled with water, I blacked out. Eventually, my brother realised that I wasn't mucking around. He thought I was joking, and he ended up pulling me out of the pool and raising the alarm for help. And it was later that night in intensive care at the third hospital that a doctor actually came and told me that I'd actually broken my neck and drowned and that I'd never walk again. It literally felt like my life was over in that moment. I, went from being this fiercely independent, active young woman to being dependent on others for absolutely everything. I ended up spending 8 weeks flat on my back with sandbags either side of my head, and had to be fed and have someone turn pages of books and scratch my head. It was an absolutely soul-destroying time. I ended up spending 7 months in hospital because the doctor said I was too young to go to a rehab centre. So I ended up leaving hospital not a lot better than what I went in. I ended up, a few days after leaving hospital, I started high school in a school far from home where I didn't know a single soul. So, it certainly felt like the universe had it in for me at that point in time. As I went through my teenage years, much like a lot of teenagers, I sought some pretty unhealthy ways to deal with how I wasn't coping with, the anger and the resentment that I felt around what had happened to me. And I spent a lot of my time drunk and stoned, which that led to deeper pits of depression, despair and anxiety. But thankfully, by the time I got towards the end of my high school years, I got myself in a better headspace and left those destructive habits behind. And it wasn't until well into my 20s that I ended up being able to completely change the way I looked at the accident. And I began to feel grateful for what had happened. I was grateful for the opportunities that had presented me. And most people look at what's happened to me and go, how on earth can ending up a quadriplegic and needing a wheelchair for the rest of your life be positive? But when people spend time with me, they realise that I'm truly happy and grateful for what's happened and the way it's changed my life and the opportunities it's presented me since.
So what do you do nowadays? You obviously are on the show for a very good reason. So tell people what it is that you're up to on a day-to-day basis now.
Yeah, from the point of time of being able to actually change the way I looked at it, then I eventually was able to, through working with incredible mentors and coaches, I was able to really see that there was some lessons that I could share with other people about how to turn adversity into an asset. So now I actually have founded the Academy of Resilience, and I do mainly corporate speaking, coaching and training, and I'm working with organisations, helping their leaders shift the way they perceive and respond to change and adversity. and published the book How to Be Resilient a few years ago, which is a process of me reverse engineering how I turned my life around from the lowest to the lows, and was able to break that down into some really simple, actionable processes that anyone can implement to help them become more resilient in their business and in their lives as well.
So the reason that we started off the show the particular way we did, which I don't, in my recollection, ever remember doing it quite like this, is because your story is so visceral and it's so vivid. And obviously one of the things that makes it so powerful is the contrast of this situation that we can all imagine ourselves in, where we're feeling helpless, or we can imagine ourselves in that situation in the aftermath and the sense of hopelessness and, you know, the feeling that was coursing through our veins of anger or sadness or resentment or any number of different things that I'm sure you went through. But in spite of that, you found the strength to turn a really challenging situation into a calling that inspires others. And there's so many motivational speakers these days that are like some 20-something white guy shouting at audiences about overcoming adversity. And here you are, your story is the real deal. So the fact that you overcame these emotional hurdles is kind of difficult to comprehend. And part of that is because one of the primary components of resilience, as I understand it, has to do with our emotions. And you were quite young at the time of this accident. So what I really want to know is, how did you find resilience at that time? And what made you believe that there was something that would come next that was greater? And you had mentioned that there was some downtime there where you were drunk and stoned a lot, and you turned to some pretty negative ways of doing it. But even the fact that you didn't go so far down that rabbit hole as to not be able to return, it is still in and of itself a really, it's just a really interesting point that you didn't go that far. So how did you find resilience even at that point to go to school, to do all the different things instead of just crushing under the weight of it?
Yeah, the resilience piece I really felt didn't come till much later. And I find that I actually feel that I was quite lucky that it happened to me at the age it did, because I had to go to school. I had to do all those things. I didn't really have a choice in the matter. So that probably was quite helpful for me. And it's interesting you touched on about not going that far down the rabbit hole. And if I look back at those first, especially the first 3 years after that, I would have given anything to either turn back time and not have had what happened, or to not be there at all. And I did have moments, and one particular time where I was so close, to checking out. And that scared me. That really scared me to even think it's not a situation you ever think you're going to find yourself in. And it really scared me. And at the time, the only thing that stopped me was the fear that someone would find me before I was gone and I'd end up worse off than what I was.
Wow.
Yeah.
Something.
Yeah, and that was the only thing that stopped me in that moment. If I had have known that that was guaranteed, that would be done, I would have done it. And like now, I just look at that and it scares me even now that I got to that point.
So this, I think, really underscores kind of the point here, the contrast point that I was making, right? So you work with executives, you talk in front of audiences, and I'm sure you've had your fair number of conversations with leaders, and they tell you their problems and they tell you what they're struggling with. And I'm curious, given the fact that your experience is one that is so profoundly intense in every possible meaning of that word, where the lows were that low, where you were that close, and where the situation that you're overcoming is such a unbelievably, everybody can put themselves in that mindset of thinking and empathizing and with, and kind of living vicariously through that story to imagine what it would be like. And that's a big, serious thing. And yet I'm sure you've probably had a conversation with some leader in some company who's dealing with some sort of very seemingly mediocre, inconsequential problem. So I guess that I'm curious, from your perspective, doing the work that you do, living and experiencing the things that you have, and doing the work that has come out of that. Do you believe that there's a hierarchy of struggle, or are all obstacles, equally valid in terms of the feeling of overcoming them. Like, do you ever hear a story from someone where you're like, oh, geez, Greg, give it a rest? Like, that's not really that big of a deal.
I'm not one to judge what people's struggles are and the impact they have on them, because it's all relative. And I think we all have a bit of we've got a threshold at times, and sometimes something that might seem, really inconsequential at one moment in time could be the straw that breaks the camel's back at another time. And what I find is that by sharing my story, again, I'm able to put things into perspective. And then I'm also able to share with them that the tools that I share with them, if I was able to use them to overcome what I've done, then if they can just, put some of those things into place on a regular basis, then, that can be incredibly powerful to shift some of those things. It's quite interesting just to see what people's take is. And sometimes people do come away and go, I have no excuse. And that's not my direct intention. And I even frame that when I'm speaking, is that I'm not going to go and scream in anybody's face, what's your excuse? Because, shaming someone into making a change or shifting the way they look at things is never going to work. And I think that's, as you said, it's like by being able to present a little bit of a contrast and go, well, look, these are just some simple things you can do. And sometimes you do, I think, particularly, when there's perhaps working with some younger people, which I don't do a lot of, but some of the things that particularly some of the teens and stuff like that they're seeing as, absolutely dire, life-changing challenges, when you do put them into perspective, are, quite minor. And that's what I mean. I'm able to actually give them some perspective that really does help them to sort of see, look, in the grand scheme of things, this is such a tiny blip.
Yeah, and I from the people that I know that have a very positive and inspired outlook, I think a lot of times it is your frame is really just looking for those silver linings and putting things into perspective continually of, it could be worse, or it could be, or like, I'm just striving for better. So there's this very like attraction to the silver lining of things. One of the things I'm curious about is you talk about resilience, and you are known as the queen of resilience. That word can mean a lot of different things to a lot of people. I think we all believe that we understand what it means, but I think I've heard you speak about this a little bit before, and I think it's important to distinguish what is resilience versus kind of like what's not resilience, especially when you take it in the perspective of looking at leadership or looking at company cultures that are resilient and kind of finding a way to bounce back. What is the difference between paying lip service to resilience versus what is actually resilience?
The different take I have on resilience is that I see resilience as a proactive strategy, whereas a lot of the talk and the stuff we see about it talks a lot about how do you cope, how do you bounce back, and I really feel that it sells it short, because bouncing back implies that we're bouncing back to a point that we started from. Whereas I really see that resilience is an opportunity to grow and learn, and it's something that, again, we need to build up. We need to have it so that we've got it there on hand when we need to use it. So a lot of particularly the corporate cultures and stuff, a lot of the places that I get asked to have a chat with their leaders about, sometimes they'll come and say, oh, we've got a resilience program. We do yoga at lunchtime. And I'm like, that's not a resilience program. That's a stress management strategy. But it's part of a program, and that's what's really important. It's actually having a mindset of being able to find the opportunities in the challenges, in the change, in the adversity. And so, as I said, it's a proactive strategy, and it's getting people to actually look for where's the gold in it? How can they grow from it? How can they actually move forward, rather than going, oh, look, how can we just cope? How can we survive?
I love that, because it's really similar to, there's a big conversation in business right now around diversity and inclusion. And in the diversity and inclusion conversation, sometimes it can feel like, oh, let's just check the boxes here. And I think from the way you describe it, it sounds very similar of like, oh, we'll have a resilience program, we'll do casual shirt Fridays and things like that. I really like the way you frame it around looking for the opportunities in the negatives. I want to talk to you a little bit about how you do these proactive steps. But before we get there, one of the things I'm most interested in your story that I'm not sure I've ever heard you talk about in any of your various interviews that I've listened to or any of the different podcasts you've been on, which I strongly encourage people to go listen to. But there's one topic that I haven't heard personally. And I want to know, so Shareable is a show about the impact of people and technology on our lives and careers. And I'm really curious about who inspires you, because you do so much to inspire others by being vulnerable and sharing your story and being there with them in the things that they're going through. Sometimes when, if you were to do like the comparison of things, you could potentially take a position where you're kind of a jerk about it and judge them, but you don't. And you give and you open up and try to inspire them to be more resilient. Who's doing that for you? What gave you the tools to be able to be the type of person that would react to the situation the way you did and that you do?
Yeah, look, I've always been inspired by seeing people that have overcome adversity as well. And like probably the one person that's had the biggest impact for me has been Layne Beachley, who is now an 8 times world surfing champion. And she was somebody that I looked up to as a younger person. And she challenged so much about surfing and particularly changing it for women. And that just really inspired. She just had so many setbacks and adversity in her life, just kept coming back, won 6 in a row, which I don't know that it will ever be topped. And then it was 5 years ago, I actually had the opportunity to apply to her foundation. She started a foundation to help high achieving women to actually, it's called Aim for the Stars. So it's actually helping people to just go even higher than where they already are. And I applied for a grant through her foundation for some sport I was doing at the time, and I got a grant. And so I got to actually work with Layne. I had her financial support. I had the support of her community. And then, being able to work closely with her has just been amazing. And she's somebody that she calls an honesty barometer. So she'll call you out on the stuff that, where you might be having a bit of a negative attitude to something, or you might be playing a bit small. And I just loved the experience I had through the 12 months that I was in that program, that I then started donating my time and money to the foundation and became an ambassador and a mentor. And Layne was the one that, pinned the Queen of Resilience crown on. It certainly wasn't something I was going to self-appoint. And yeah, so spending time with her has been amazing, and the community that she's built has been brilliant. And so I look, it's a bit of a mutual admiration society, just looking at all these amazing women that are doing great things, and I get a lot of inspiration from there. And inspiration is actually a really funny thing, because I find that people do seek a lot of external inspiration, and I think that's great for the top-up stuff. But I sort of feel if our primary source of inspiration doesn't come from within, then for the long term it won't be sustainable. So it's an interesting thing to really balance, making sure that you've got that real internal drive and know what you stand for and what you're working towards. But then just seeking those external, great stories, great people, great experiences that do really lift and energize and inspire you.
I love that. It's interesting. I didn't know where the title of Queen of Resilience came from, but I absolutely love it. So my LinkedIn headline is the world's most handsome social media and content marketing strategist. So,
I love it.
So when I saw Queen of Resilience, I was like, okay, girl, go ahead. So I think since that was bestowed upon you, I think you should add an "and" to it, and you should come up with your own swaggerific little title that's Queen of Resilience, and then you fill in the blank with something that's like also completely over the top. Because I think you should. I think you deserve it. You can do it.
Okay, that's my homework.
Yeah, that's my assignment for you.
Okay, done.
Yeah. So, oh my God, there's so many things for us to talk about. I'm going to table this one thing that I just wrote now for a little bit later. So where I want to go now is I want to talk a little bit about the how. I want to talk briefly just about you talk a lot about giving people simple steps for resilience. I think what's nice is that you're not making this resilience thing into like a textbook. It doesn't have to be something that's far away. I think you're trying to make it very accessible for people. And I'm a huge fan of frameworks and operating from kind of like simple principles and mantras and things that just work and are easy to remember. So I know there's a lot to your program of resilience and a lot of things to think about and a lot of scenarios to deal with, et cetera. But if you could boil it down, and we can go into a lot of different places here, but if you had to boil it down into one thing, what would you say is the secret sauce of resilience?
Well, I like for people to actually look at resilience as the same way as they would look at going to the gym. So it's finding these simple practices done consistently and repeatedly what build that resilient strength. And the easiest place to start is by asking yourself every day, what was the best thing that happened today? And because we get what we look for, and unfortunately a lot of people find themselves in a bit of a downward spiral when things aren't going to plan, and so they just keep finding more and more problems, and it just becomes overwhelming. So it's a little bit of a state change at times. It can be just going, okay, so what was the best thing? And if you start to do that, then you start to see the bright spots, you start to see more of the good. So the practice I get people to start with that is just to, start a journal of any shape or form, and for it to not be intimidating, just to write a sentence every day and just answering that simple question. So I just sort of found, coming from a place of gratitude, it just shifts everything. And when something doesn't go to plan, the first thing to do is just say thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be who I am, where I am, with what I have at this moment in time. And it sounds totally counterintuitive, but you can't feel bad about something you're grateful for. So just shifting that energy straight away is the simplest place to start. And there's a lot of other things that we can do, but I just find that's probably the most powerful place to start, and that done consistently makes the world of good. And by doing that, you actually start to change the way you describe things, the language that you use. And we know that perception's reality. So whatever label we give something is the experience we're going to have of it. And I did a talk yesterday for some first year film production students, and talking about the highs and lows of the creative process. And they were talking a lot about anxiety, and recognizing that the physical symptoms of anxiety and excitement are exactly the same, different label, totally different experience. So just by starting to do that, focusing on what was the good part, what was what went well, and then you really start to shift the language that you use, and it totally shifts the experience we have every day.
I love that, because in that I heard a couple of things that are really powerful in so many areas of life. The first being discipline is one of the kind of, one of the underlying principles of what you were talking about. So just having the discipline to do something day in and day out, such as asking yourself that question. And then the second thing I really liked was that you're talking about the concept of framing, which is that you're really shifting the perspective that you see one particular idea or event or whatever. You're shifting the frame that you're looking at it through. And I really appreciate that you have both of those in there, because we see it so much in so many of the great books and guiding speakers and figures in the concepts of leadership and personal growth. So it's obvious that there's a consistent through line here. So I guess the natural next question to ask you would be then, what's the best thing that happened to you today?
Well, the day's only just begun for me, so
wow, that's right. It's like end of day over here.
Yeah, so I've only been awake for 2 hours.
Well, I guess in that case, I'm competing with breakfast if you're talking to me. So you either had an amazing breakfast, or talking with me has to have been the best part.
Yeah, absolutely the best part. Absolutely the best part. There's no breakfast that would have competed with this, that's for sure. But yeah, it is the simple practice, and as you touched on, the discipline. So when I started that process of doing the, what's the best thing, and starting that process of journaling, I knew that it had to be a no exceptions process. And in those first 90 days until it became the habit, then I would actually get out of bed. Like I would hop into bed to go to sleep, and I'd realize I hadn't done my journal. So I actually got back out of bed, which for me, being a quadriplegic, isn't an easy thing to do. It takes a lot of effort, but I did, and that was how I was able to cement that process and be able to create that discipline of doing that. So it's certainly a good thing. But I guess if we're looking at what was the best thing that happened yesterday, yesterday was definitely having a chat with the first year students that are, venturing out into the creative world of screen production, and having the opportunity to be a guest lecturer in that context was amazing. And it was just so incredibly well received, and the questions I got asked were amazing. I was really overwhelmed by just how engaged they were, and I didn't think they were ever going to stop applauding, which, sometimes that can, feel a little bit funny after a while, but it was amazing.
That's awesome. Yeah, I find even the slightest compliment is often very uncomfortable for me to take. So I can't imagine okay, stop clapping. I want to know a little bit about where you want to go with everything. So you have found this career in, public speaking, in working with leaders. What's the end goal for you? What's the impact you want to make on the world with the work that you're doing? Is it something that's more tangible? Is it something that's more kind of like aspirational and in the kind of the visionary sort of way of framing it? What would you say you're trying to do right now with what you're doing?
Right now, my goal is to really, as I said, shift the way that people perceive and respond change and adversity, particularly change, because we're in such a rapidly changing time, and people are really struggling with it. So, what I'm getting really wanting to people to do is actually get excited about change, which it sounds like it is probably a stretch at times, but getting people to actually be excited about change and realising that there is great opportunity in it. I also really feel that one of my main purposes in doing what I do is to demonstrate that as humans we are bigger than our circumstances. So being able to actually help people realise that the circumstances that they're in at this moment in time doesn't define them. That's not what they're all about, and that's not their entire life. And as part of those approaches, one of the things that I guess my mortal enemy is the entitlement mentality. My real approach to life is that I'm grateful for everything and entitled to nothing. And if I can really help people to begin to see that no one owes them anything. In fact, I feel we owe the world so much for the opportunity that we have just merely being here day in, day out. And I just feel that I have this incredible sense of a moral responsibility now to share what I do, to help people actually to see the value that they have as a person, the influence that every single one of us has. And for people to actually own that and love it that really drives me.
That's amazing. I want to take that further because I want to call back to something you talked about earlier. So you mentioned Layne Beachley, and you mentioned this program that you were a part of, and the idea of shooting for the stars. So if you were to take what you're trying to do right now and all of the goals that you just kind of summed up and talked about and the impact you want to make, if you were to shoot for the stars and define and paint a picture for us of the future and the big impact that you have, talk to me a little bit about that. What does shooting for the stars look like for you? How big do you want this to be? How many people do you want to touch? What's the big shooting for the stars goal for you?
Yeah, look, impact has been something that's really, really driven me, and I've really struggled over the last year or so. Impact was my theme for last year. And that was really something that I was looking at, okay, is that impact as in sheer numbers of people impacted, or is that the depth of the impact that I can have with the people that I work with? So for me, I've really, you really agonise about it. And also being Australian, it's a bit difficult because we have a massive issue here with the tall poppy syndrome. So it's a big challenge to, at times, actually really feel that you can go out and be bold and really state what you really want to do, because there are so many people that really want to peg you back a level. So that's been really interesting. So for a while I did struggle with that, but if I really wrap it up, like what I feel that if I could get, I would love to get to the point where anywhere in the world, if someone hears the word resilience, they think of me.
That's awesome.
Then that's my sort of, that's the measure, isn't it?
Yeah, no, that would be fantastic. And that when they think of you, they think of what it is that you talk about, and they remember the lessons that you've given, and that they think about installing that in their life on a more frequent basis.
Yeah, and just saying that it is simple, like not easy, but it is simple. And really challenging the perspective, because I sort of feel so much of the stuff that's out about resilience is very academic. It's very, it's driven by psychologists and researchers. And I'm quite proud to say now, even though I was really fearful that I wasn't qualified to speak about resilience in the beginning, I'm quite proud to say I'm not an academic or a psychologist. So you don't need a degree to figure out what I'm talking about. It's just really, really simple stuff that whether you're 6 years old or you're 70 years old, like you can pick it up and run with it.
Yeah, it's kind of as an outsider, it's kind of a laughable perspective that somebody would question your views on resilience. Like, just, coming from an outside perspective, like, duh. I want to ask you just just a clarifying question, because you said something earlier that being an Australian, you said tall poppy syndrome?
Yeah. So I'm not...
Did I get that right? Tall poppy?
Yeah,
like poppy
it is like poppy plants. So the idea is that what happens is when those tall poppies grow, then the people want to chop them down to try and bring them back to the level that everybody else is at. And it is probably the most negative thing about being Australian is that, and it also creates this a real fear of being bold and being proud of what we do. And I still remember when I first started on this journey, like I first shared my story on stage about 7.5 years ago. So this is still, like, considering, like, I'm 40 years old now. So this has been, it's been 28 years since I had my accident, and it's been a really long time getting to the point where I was able to have people really have me believe that there was value in me sharing my story. And I didn't want to share my story because I thought that everyone would think I was a total tosser for talking about myself, because that was the Australian in me. Like, growing up in the suburbs of Sydney, you were never encouraged to talk about your achievements, to even talk about the big things you wanted to achieve. So it's really challenging to do that. So now I just have to realise that if anyone, I do talk about this in the context of resilience, is that you really got to make sure that you surround yourself with people that are going to be your cheerleaders, who support and encourage you, and make sure that you really don't give the time and energy to those that want to hold you back.
I love that. So I ask a pretty standard question. I'm curious if what you just said will answer it, or whether you go a different direction. But I often like to know, for people who have found personal and professional success, what the lesson they wish they learned earlier in their career is. And I'm curious if you're going to say something along the lines of not to let other people convince me that I shouldn't be the tallest poppy.
Yeah, that would be probably part of it. And along the same lines, it's really valuing my experience and seeing that there was so much that people could learn from me. Like, I always knew I was here to make a difference, but I really didn't know that just by being myself and sharing my journey and what I've learned. And that's probably the big thing. And just realising, much earlier on, that I'm enough. I think that's probably with a lot of people, is knowing that, really just by living our best lives and sharing that out loud. And I could have done that a really long time ago. But, I didn't, because I didn't believe in that, and I was scared of that judgment. So, and you know what? People probably still judge me, but, that's their projection, not anything about me personally.
Yeah. I want to ask you one more question. And it's about the role of humor in, one, in resilience, and two, in your personal experience. How much has humor played a role in contributing to your ability to be resilient, to be able to laugh in the face of adversity, to be able to laugh at yourself, to be able to not take things too seriously? I guess combining lightheartedness and humor, I'm curious how much of a role that played for you, because I know in my own experiences where I'm struggling with things, sometimes the only thing that can pull me out of the kind of the shitstorm of it, for lack of a better term, like the worst parts, is laughing, is like not taking things as seriously, is lightening up a bit so that I can see things a little bit more clearly. I'm curious how much humor has played a role in your life and in how you talk about resiliency.
Absolutely, it's played a huge part, and that's what a lot of people do comment on, particularly in my keynotes, is the humour. And it's not, completely self-deprecating, but it's just being able to look at some of the things that, when you do pull them apart, they're really quite absurd. And so you have to laugh at it. And it's one of the, your thing, there were a lot of situations, it's like if you don't laugh, you would literally cry. And it is having to look at the funny side of it. And as I said, just taking that helicopter view sometimes and looking at, from the big picture and going, if you look at it from that way, it is really quite hilarious how we actually do react at times to things that are trivial and insignificant. But I think that humour is incredible because humour gives us the opportunity to actually potentially challenge people in a way that if you didn't do it under the guise of humour, then it may come across as potentially a bit of a personal attack, or it gives us an opportunity to really put forward some interesting messages, and particularly social messages that you can do under humour that you just couldn't do if or people wouldn't even engage with it. And, it's with anything, it's if you don't have an emotional response or an emotional engagement with something, then it's not going to stick and it's not going to land. So throughout the course of sharing something, if we can get people to laugh or cry or both, then that is actually going to then really get hardwired into their being.
I love it. Well, your story is amazing. I enjoyed so much the time we've spent here today, but also just the time getting ready for this podcast, seeing all the stuff that you're doing. It's inspiring. It's awesome. Before I let you go, I want to take you through a couple things that I call the shareables. There's some rapid fire questions so you can pass on some things that you think other people should know about. So I've got a couple different questions. I want you to answer them as quickly as you can. And then we'll wrap from there. Does that sound good?
Shoot.
All right, cool. Here we go. What's one book every person should read?
Think and Grow Rich was a life changer for me.
Awesome. What's your favorite podcast?
My favorite podcast, I do love Craig Ballantyne's podcast, Early to Rise Radio. And what's the other one I've been listening to a lot lately? Completely escaped me. But that's the one that, Early to Rise. I'm really enjoying the strategies and the interviews on there.
Awesome. Okay. What's one application, mobile or desktop, that everyone should go and download and you can't say Evernote?
Oh, damn it. How did you know I was going to say Evernote?
Everyone says Evernote for that. So I have to remove it.
Because Evernote is such a life changer.
Yeah, it's everything.
Probably the other one that I use, Audible at the moment. I'm just loving Audible. So Audible and podcasts. So anything that I can learn on the go is awesome.
Awesome. I'm a huge fan. I just got into Audible about maybe 2 months ago, and I've just been crushing audiobooks.
Love it.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to ask you another question that I have a caveat to and an answer, a restricted answer, I guess. But what is the most important skill of the future? And you can't say empathy, but I think I know where you're going to go with it.
I think you know exactly where I'm going to go with it. And it's absolutely resilience. It's the foundation of everything. I think if you have those skills, then anything is possible.
Oh, man, I set you right up for that one. Okay.
Oh, you did. Beautiful. Thank you.
You're welcome. If you could have one superpower or one superhero or supervillain's entire set of powers, what would it be?
My superpower, I would love to teleport because I'm not a big fan of travel. I want to see the world, but I don't want to spend half my life on a plane.
That's so funny. All right, final question. And this one's very, very important
Yes.
because it is a very specific question, the way it's worded for a very specific reason. And it is, what's one thing that everybody listening to this episode right now should go and do today? It's something they have to be able to go and do today.
Is to pick up a pen and a paper or an online program, and at the end of the day, before they call it a night, is actually write what was the best thing that happened today.
Love it. All right, now is your chance. I want you to tell people where they can go and be social with you, learn more about what you're working on, and how they can help you or hire you.
Yeah, you can find me on any of the social platforms at Stacey Copas. Stacey Copas. Thankfully, there's not many of us out there in the world. Definitely engage with me. Ask me questions. If you have an audience that you would love to shift the way that they perceive and respond to change and adversity, then absolutely reach out to me. I manage all of my stuff, so if you send me a message, I will respond personally, and I really look forward to hearing how this has helped you or any questions you have about it.
Outstanding. Well, I think you've been a phenomenal guest in every possible way. So I guess if I had to say that this episode was anything, if I had to sum it up in one word, aside from resilient, which we've covered a lot of, I guess I would say this episode is shareable.
Wait, the show's not over yet. I have some important announcements. If you made it this far, you're clearly a dedicated fan, or you're in the middle of vacuuming and just haven't hit stop on your podcasting app. Whatever the case, we want to thank you. We're not just music to your ears, we're music to your inbox. If you subscribe to our email list at shareablepodcast.com/subscribe, not only will you get access to our private Facebook group, you'll also get all of our blog posts, newsletters, special announcements, and more. You won't find any of that in your podcast feed. You can follow the show at shareable_pod on Twitter and just Shareable Podcast on everything else. You can find Jeff online at jeffgibber.com, and you can connect with me on Twitter at Caroline Sohn because I don't have a website yet. So go ahead, call us, leave a message, subscribe to our list, leave a rating, review us on iTunes, tell a friend, tell your mom. If she's like my mom, she'll love it. And now for the thank you portion to all the folks that make this podcast possible. Shout out to DJ Quads for the use of our theme song, Always, and Ahamitsu for the use of our outro song, Adventures. And a big thank you to Ray Bueno for all of that sexy production value.